Hello and welcome to IGPP Expert Talks. I'm Heena Goswami, Editorial Consultant with IGPP, Institute for Governance, Policies and Politics, New Delhi. India today is passing through a transitory period. Whether one judges it to be good or bad, one cannot deny that what happens today will define the nation for a long time to come. To discuss the Indian society and polity that we live in today, we have with us Christopher Jaffrelot. Christopher Jaffrelot is Avanta Chair and Professor of Indian Politics and Sociology at King's India Institute and also the research lead for the Global Institute, King's College London. An overseas fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, he writes regularly for Indian newspapers and international newspapers and has authored over 6 books. Welcome to IGPP Expert Talk, sir.
Thank you for the invitation.
So let's dive directly into the question. I'll first begin with what got you interested in Indian polity and society. And you have been observing India for a very long time now. How have you seen India change since the first time you started studying or theorizing upon the Indian subcontinent?
Well, I got interested in Indian society first. I went to India for the first time in 1984 and immediately found the social dynamic fascinating, intellectually challenging. And therefore, I started working on, mostly the societal developments at work at that time. On one end, you had the beginning of the Ayodhya movement, 84. On the other end, you had the Sikh mobilization that was, of course, eating the headlines with the Blue Star operation and so on. And already there, the rise of OBCs, Dalit politics, Kisan politics. So yes, these were the things I worked on. And of course, over the last 40 years, we've seen so many transformation happening. Clearly, things changed in 2 phases during these last decades. One, we had the rise of a new form of democracy, especially after Mandal, the rise of OBCs, Dalits, what I've called the plebeianization of politics and society in India, and democratization is a better word. And this democratization process, of course, culminated under the Manmohan Singh governments when we saw more federalism, rights to information, right to education, right to food, NREGA, a real attempt at developing a welfare state. And then, of course, the second phase or the following phase that is still on after 2014, something I anticipated because between 2001 and 2020, I've studied Gujarat. My next book is on Gujarat under Modi, under Narendra Modi. So what we've seen after 2014, and we are going to return to that in details, is clearly opening a new phase. That's the, I would say, basic trajectory I can summarize to begin with.
Hindu nationalism has been one of the areas that you have studied, researched upon. India has always been a deeply religious society, with Hinduism being one of the religion practiced by majority of its population. But what factors would you attribute that have ushered in the Hindu nationalism and the political discourse that we see around today?
Well, I would not consider that Hindutva is true to Hinduism. Hinduism and Hindutva are completely different entities. And by the way, when you look at the books of Savarkar, of Golwalkar, you see that the way they define Hindutva is not connected to religion. Hindus are a people inheriting the blood of the Vedic fathers, as they say, inhabiting a secret territory, and therefore it's not based on religion. It's based on mostly identity politics, ethnic politics. And if you try to find out what are the main reasons for the rise of Hindutva over the last 20 years or so, I would mention two. One, there is the rise of Islamism and the role Pakistan played supporting Islamist forces and supporting infiltration of Jammu and Kashmir, attacks on Mumbai and so on. So there is a dialectic. Hindu nationalism is a response to Islamism. And it's not new. It's absolutely the rule. RSS was founded in 1925. Hindutva, who is a Hindu, was written in 1923 in reaction to the Khilafat movement. So for the last 100 years, there is a dialectic between both forms of instrumentalization of religion on the Muslim side and on the Hindu side. But the other reason why I think we've seen Hindutva politics taking off at the turn of the 21st century has to do with caste politics. Hindutva is a response to Mandal. The fear of dominant caste as well as upper caste, Savarnas, to see plebeians taking over power economically, politically, well, led them to close ranks. And we've seen, therefore, in the early 90s, mid-90s, dominant caste, Patels in Gujarat, Jats in West UP and elsewhere, joining hands with upper caste and the upper caste dominated party that was BJP. And BJP was the only party that explicitly rejected positive discrimination based on caste. So I think that was another major booster. Both things played a very important role.
You have referred to the emergency period under Indira Gandhi as India's first dictatorship. We do see that, politics and society under the Hindutva regime since 2014 has had some effect on the Indian society, politics, media, academia. And many political commentators allege that this is a period of undeclared emergency. Is that a view you would agree with? And how has it affected media and academia, two fields that one would associate with you?
Yeah, well, undeclared emergency is a formula that can be interpreted in many different ways. So I see why it can be a relevant characterization of the situation, because like in 75, 77, fear is palpable. In fact, Chief Justice Chandrachud has just declared that there is fear even in the courtroom in India today. So fear is palpable in many different circles. In fact, Mr. Bajaj told the same thing to Amit Shah a few years ago. And the reasons for this fear is similar to what we saw in the mid-70s, IT raids, ED raids. Yeah, that's one common feature. But I would say the emergency was a very different episode for two reasons. One, it was much more brutal. The state used much more violent means. If you think in terms of the number of people who went behind bars, 100,000 opponents went behind bars. If you think about the forced sterilization, millions of people, probably 7 to 10 million people. Then if you think in terms of deportation, Kashmiri Gate, so many other places from where the slum dwellers were driven out, it was much more brutal. At the same time, it was also different because in contrast to what we see today, there was no plan. Mrs. Gandhi declared the emergency in a rather amateurish manner. She had not thought about what would happen the day after or the month after, for sure the year after. Well, by contrast, the present regime fits in a long-term plan. And another clear difference related to that one is that Congress was a very weak organization. Sangh Parivar is a very well-oiled organization with disciplined volunteers, and not only RSS Swayamsevaks, but of course vigilante groups, so many offshoots, so many subsidiaries, trade union, student union, ABVP, peasant union, and so on and so forth. So here there is, of course, a big difference. And in the same framework, I would add one more, and the last one. Mrs. Gandhi was secular, and certainly she used religion for political objectives, and she did it very foolishly in Punjab, in Assam, but she was secular. By contrast, of course, the aim here, the end goal is to transform India into Hindu Rashtra, and we see minorities, Muslims, Christians transformed into second-class citizens de facto in India today. But that fits in the second difference. I mean, the second point I wanted to make. It's a very well planned, organized strategy when the emergency was a kind of outburst. And in fact, Mrs. Gandhi lifted the emergency the same way she had imposed it, without knowing what would come next. And she lost. And she lost the 1977 elections. So yes, there are similarities, but many, many differences.
How would you say it has affected academia and media?
Well, this is clearly related to the fear factor I was mentioning. We see the academia and the media losing gradually but quickly what they cherish the most: freedom of expression. And it's very similar on both sides, the process. Of course, when you have public universities, public media, it's clear. You appoint fellow travelers as VCs, as media persons. So you kill literally institutions which have been among the best in India lately, GNU being one of them, and they are very resilient in this context. But if you turn to the private sector, it's very interesting to see that you can also control the private universities, the private media indirectly. In most of the cases, these institutions belong to businessmen, and businessmen need the state. They need the government's clearances for so many of their activities. So you don't need to directly antagonize the VCs of private universities or the journalists or the editors of newspapers. You talk to the owners, and the owners will make everybody fall in line. And in this context, it's really remarkable to see how courageous some individuals, some initiatives, enterprises, you can say, departments of Ashoka University and others are today. Again, there is some resilience. There is a lot of courage on that side, not among the owners who are their own interest to protect.
No. One of the changes that you mentioned in one of the interviews that, even elections are no longer level playing field between BJP versus amongst. How do you view Congress victory in Karnataka and the forging of the new alliance, India? Do you think they'll be able to provide some resistance to the Hindu nationalist discourse that has been set in motion by BJP and the Sangh Parivar?
Certainly. Well, when I said elections are not a level playing field anymore, I referred mostly to Lok Sabha elections, because these are the elections when you see two things at work. One, the media coverage that is clearly imbalanced. Two, the kind of money that is spent. And this is a very opaque field, so we don't know we don't know much, but we do see that the kind of money that is spent by the ruling party is, well, much more than what opposition can mobilize. So that makes the competition a very imbalanced one. Now, at the state level, we see something different, and Karnataka is the last instance. We see opposition parties in a better position to fight and win. Sometimes they win, but they lose power, because as we saw in Madhya Pradesh and Karnataka before, defections are very easy to engineer if you do not win with a sufficient majority. Now, you ask about the new coalition, India. Yes, it can definitely make a difference. I think for two reasons. Why many state parties have realized that what was at stake was their own existence. Some parties are not that lucid, BJD in Orissa being one of them, BSP in UP being probably also one of them. But other parties have realized that the kind of negotiation they were trying to establish with the center would not save them, at least not forever. And we saw AAP realizing, for instance, that to be on the opposition side more systematically would certainly be a better policy. But the other reason why India is so meaningful, and I mentioned AAP, but I could have mentioned GDU, of course, as well, and Nitish Kumar. But the other reason why India can make a difference next year is because of the new leadership that Rahul Gandhi has endowed the Congress Party with. The Congress Party is back to some extent, and Karnataka elections bear testimony of that, for two reasons. The yatra that Rahul Gandhi accomplished showed that he was a man of the people. He could relate to the people in a very different manner, but very effectively. And two, there were elections. There were party elections, and it's too early to draw any conclusion from that. But if Karnataka is an indication, we see factionalism less prevalent. We've seen the party organization more robust. And now, of course, the next test is Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh, and Telangana. But if Congress does well, yes, it can be the core around which the other opposition parties would rally with some hope of making a real difference in the 2024 election.
Alongside India, we see that there are disruptions happening in democracies all around the world. There's a rise in populist politics, there's a rise in fundamentalism, whether it is in USA, Europe, or the subcontinent itself. Do you see what is happening in India as part of a larger global pattern, or do you think it's something that is uniquely Indian? And I asked especially because on PM Modi's recent visits to US and France, there was much hype, and he was honored, awarded, but there was not much talk about the status of democracy. These two nations, despite the fact that these two nations are themselves democratic. So is that a part of a larger pattern?
Certainly, but there are two questions in one there. One is, yes, there is a wave of national populism across the globe. Populism very often works like that. In the 70s, there was a wave of, if you want, populism of the left. Indira Gandhi, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, Mrs. Bandaranaike were emulating what Perón was representing in Argentina, Latin America at large, experienced the same kind of populism of the West, of the left. Now we have a new brand of populism. You can say populism of the right. I prefer to call it national populism because wherever you look at, be it in Erdogan's Turkey, Netanyahu's Israel, Philippines with Duterte, who has left the scene, but who epitomized the same model. Of course, Imran Khan was representing the same thing on the Pakistani side, and the Rajapakses in Sri Lanka. Now, wherever you look at, and Orban, of course, in Hungary, and Kaczynski in Poland, and Meloni in Italy, wherever you look at, these national populists claim that they defend their people, but their people are not made of all the citizens. Their people are made of the sons of the soil, and they exclude migrants, they exclude minorities systematically. They mobilize a majoritarian agenda by excluding, fighting the other. So it has a lot to do with hate. It has a lot to do with xenophobia. That's clearly something we see everywhere. And of course, Donald Trump represented exactly that. And Bolsonaro also. The list is very long. So yes, it fits in a specific moment. There is a kind of zeitgeist, as you would say, the spirit of the time. So the specificity of India in this context is very limited. It is very similar to what we see elsewhere. So you have variants. Modi is probably closer to Erdogan because they have a strong nationalistic ideology, a strong organization behind them. By contrast, Bolsonaro had no party and had to create one, but without using it. So there are variants, there are differences, but limited compared to how similar these people and these regimes are. Now, you ask another question about the way Narendra Modi has been received lately in the US, in France. Well, in fact, you could have a longer list. UK, Germany. What does it mean? It means that certainly Western countries, in spite of being democracies, or these countries claiming to be liberal democracies, are themselves losing interest somewhat in the defense of democracy. Why? Because there are other priorities, national security and China. China is now the enemy number one. Biden is in a way inheriting from Trump the same kind of attitude, even though the style is different and the vocabulary is different. So to resist China, India is perceived as a natural partner. Whether that is bound to remain the rule or the, I would say, future scenario is very difficult to say, because India is asked to show that it is helping the West, and the fact that it has not taken side in the Ukraine war has made its legitimacy on that front rather unclear. But to explain the attitude of Macron and Biden and others, I think you can certainly factor in this psychosis. You can say the Chinese syndrome, and that is something that will probably last for some time, a long time even.
To end the interview on a positive note, you have written that India hasn't reached a point of no return. So where do your hopes for a better, more democratic India lie?
Well, India has a very vibrant civil society. Even if NGOs have a very tough time today because of FCRA and so on, you have this network of NGOs that is still intact. I mean, at least resilient again. I prefer to use that word again. You have intellectuals, you have, and you have a civilization that has accommodated multiculturalism for centuries. And that is what is at stake. Can the Hindustani civilization that was made of all kinds of communities, of course, Hindus and Muslims who spoke the same language, who had the same cuisine, who played the same music, who had the same architecture, painting style, and so on. But beyond that, we have always seen India as as a kind of salad bowl where all kinds of communities were in interaction. You can't abolish that so quickly, but of course you can in the long term, and that, of course, I repeat, what is at stake. There'll be a moment when the point of no return will be reached. We saw that on the Pakistani side. There are countries that will never go back to the kind of amity that communities used to experience in the past. Pakistan is probably one of them. Sri Lanka, possibly another one. Israel, for sure, unfortunately. Can India become a bigger Israel? Is that the future? Or can India return to the kind of multiculturalism it had cultivated for centuries? This is clearly the key question, and I have no response to that one.
Thank you so much. I'm so
You're most
grateful
welcome.
that